Now, I say we want to go out into the culture and talk about stuff. We want to deal with this. Again, the point of these Odyssey lessons is this mic on, by the way? I can't tell. Okay. The point of these Odyssey lessons is to prepare us for engagement in the culture. And there are not many things in the culture that are more prevalent, especially in college campuses, than something like critical theory. This is a branch of deconstruction. We talked last time I was here, we talked about deconstruction on a more personal basis, specifically as it related to the scriptures and to the Christian faith, and how out of this philosophy that Derrida created roughly in the 60s, out of that philosophy came this kind of critical movement focused on trying to tear apart Christian doctrine and examine it without context, and that's kind of where that comes from. That is only really half of the story. So while that is also an area that the church has found itself under attack in the past 20 years, it's been pretty bad. There's another area related to that the church has been under attack for about the past 20 years, and that is deconstruction in the context of critical theory. Now, it's important to understand, we'll get into this more, but it's important to understand that when I say critical theory, I do not mean critical race theory. Critical race theory is a critical theory, but it is a subcategory of critical theory. So I want you to keep in mind that this is not focused on the sole topic of critical race theory, even though that is the one that I think has the most baggage attached to it in the culture today. There are other aspects. A lot of the feminist movements are critical theories. The gender theory stuff going around today is related to critical theory. We're not going to, well, we might get into how to respond to individual aspects of it later, but for the gist of this lesson is more along the lines of, I want to examine critical theory critically, honestly, and examine it against a scriptural backdrop to see if there are any compatibilities within critical theory and the Christian faith. So, that said, let's start talking about philosophy, because I know Mason was waiting for this ever since he knew that we were going to talk about this. Okay, so the three I would say are the most common that you really need to know here are going to be Karl Marx, Derrida, and Foucault. Those are the guys that are the most influential when it comes to critical theory. And again, I realize I haven't defined critical theory. We will get to that. But before we get into critical theory at all, I really want you to understand where these ideas come from. And again, I realize that some people might not like the philosophy side, Mason, but I do think it is important to understand the origin of these ideas and to realize that this didn't just arise up out of nothing in the past 20 years. This is a tree that's been growing for well over 100 years in some ways. So let's talk a little bit about the history of philosophy. Critical theory is, generally speaking, the result, like modern critical theory. We'll get into the distinction too. There's actually a postmodern critical theory and just kind of like what I call a regular critical theory. The postmodern version, the kind of critical theory that we deal with today, is the result of two branches of, I don't want to necessarily say philosophy, but we'll call it philosophy. The first kind of, again, I've talked about this before. The first comes out of the Kantian school of phenomenology and kind of how do we perceive things, right? So again, I'm not going to go over this too much because we've already talked about this in other lessons, but modern philosophy more or less begins with Descartes, and anyone who says otherwise is just doesn't understand. But what Descartes gave rise to was kind of an empirical movement, and in my mind, the most influential of the empiricists was David Hume. So Descartes, right, he challenged everything, not intentionally, but he was trying to set forth, like, what is the basic axiom of human philosophy? What is something that we can all point to as an agreement? So what he did in order to do that is he assumed that nothing could be proven true, and he started with well, what's the one thing that we know that must be assumed in order for everything else to follow? And of course, his famous statement, I think, therefore I am, was kind of the axiom upon which he built an entire philosophical system. However, in the process of doing that, he cast skepticism on everything, right? How do I know? How can I be sure philosophically, in my mind, how can I be sure that when I look out there, I see you guys and that's actually you guys, where there's no way to actually verify that? So he just kept reducing and cutting things out until he got back to, well, I'm doubting these things. I have skepticism of these things. And since I doubt, I'm thinking something must be doing the thinking. So if I doubt, I think, and if I think, I am, right? I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, of course, is the famous Descartes thing. So Descartes, because of his skepticism, gave rise to an empiricist worldview. Empiricism is just the idea that the only thing in reality is that which we can experience through the senses. There's no need for kind of the metaphysical realm of things. And of course, the most famous and influential of these empiricists is David Hume, who was a staunch anti-Christian and did a lot to try to argue against Christianity. And I'd say the next major development, there's a lot of people that reckon with that in different ways. Jonathan Edwards is actually one of them, who has this kind of idea of there being everything is metaphysical. He's kind of like a metaphysical empiricist, which is an interesting kind of fusion. But really the next huge development in philosophy comes along with Kant, who kind of affirms, we talked about this in the presuppositionalist lesson, he kind of affirms an empiricist worldview, but is more along the lines of, well, okay, yes, all we can really know is what we experience, but there also are things in reality, right? So he kind of separates between what are things that we can see and what are things as they are in reality. This is known as the phenomenological noumenal distinction. That's his terminology for it. Something in reality, something in the mind. Those are the two distinctions. And from Kant, we get a lot of not good. There's not much good in the philosophical realm that comes out of Kant. He, at the point in that time that Kant is writing, he completely divorces reality from perception, right? Those are really the two things at stake here. And Kant he just divorces those two things and says, yes, finally, we can say definitively that we can't know reality, but we have these transcendentals to kind of help us assume that there is a reality is really kind of where he's going with that, right? So now we get to the 1900s, and the giant wrecking ball of Kant comes along and divorces perception from reality. And then Nietzsche is more of a wrecking ball where everyone who's trying to say something other than Kant gets kind of demolished, and Kant also kind of gets demolished, but it didn't really work out that way long-term in history. And so you get to the 1900s where everything is kind of a mess in the realm of philosophy. And you have guys, an important guy in this kind of tree is Martin Heidegger, who was a German philosopher. And he puts a lot of emphasis in the language of things and how we communicate them. And that's actually kind of where Derrida comes out of. And I know I have Marx up here, and we'll get more into Derrida later. But Derrida comes out of that and makes a distinction between, well, okay, we can't know things in reality, but not only that, we can't actually even communicate the things in our mind because that's purely subjective, right? The things in our mind are just how do we perceive them. When I say something that I perceive, people might perceive it differently. And then Foucault comes out of that, and we'll get more into Foucault in a little bit. But that's one branch out of which the philosophy that gives rise to critical theory comes, right? Everything has moved philosophically after Descartes from there being an objective reality to there being basically no objective reality, or at least none that can be effectively communicated or understood. So that's where there's that pure subjectivity that really comes out of that Enlightenment philosophy. But then there's another branch of philosophy that really kind of begins with Charles Darwin, and the guy that was right around the same time as Charles Darwin is Karl Marx. So Marx is the most influential, I have no bones about saying this either, Marx is the most influential philosopher since the 1800s, and it's not even really close. And I hate that that's the case, but it's true. Derrida is famous for saying that the specter of Marx ought to be reckoned with, And he's absolutely right. We ought to reckon with Marx. We're going to do a little bit of that today. But it's important to understand that Marx and Darwin have their own kind of separate branch. Marx is kind of a Darwinist. I don't think he knew too much about Darwin because they were contemporaries, but he did like the idea of evolution. And there's kind of an evolutionary bent to his social thought. So Marx and Darwin were kind of a 1-2 punch. Darwin created a series of scientific revolutions that resulted in a casting off of religion and science that began with this kind of anti-religious view of science kind of started with Francis Bacon around the same time as Descartes. And that kind of anti-Christianity in science culminates really in the 1840s or so with Charles Darwin and Origin of the Species. And by the way, I want to say there's a common misconception nowadays where a lot of people who believe in evolution will say that it was not intended as a counter ideology to Christianity. Those people have never ever read the people who started evolution. There's no question. When you read Thomas Huxley, when you read Haeckel, Darwin, Lamarck, all of these guys who are early proponents of evolution, all either explicitly or directly opposed religion and pursued scientific observation as something either separate or contradictory to religious principles. None of these people, and you'll hear people say oh, Darwin wasn't a non-Christian. He actually believed in God. None of these people, including Darwin, were Christian in any orthodox sense. Okay, so this idea that evolution was not inherently compatible. Thomas Huxley is a great example. He was the bulldog. He's called Darwin's bulldog. He was the guy that really popularized evolution in mainstream thought. He actually, in one of his books, he starts off by saying, oh yeah, we came up with evolution because the law of Moses, the Bible, stood as a kind of barrier between us and where we wanted to be. So we had to reckon with the Bible. He straight up said, he's not even trying to hide that this is an anti-biblical worldview. That to him, that is actually kind of the point. So it's just kind of nonsense to say that it's not an anti-biblical worldview. There are the other side of that on kind of more of the Marxist side. So once evolution had been kind of proliferated in the scientific realm, it spread to everything else, more or less. Freud is heavily evolutionist in his psychoanalysis. Nietzsche is just an animal, but he didn't really like Darwin, but he kind of liked evolution. But he liked evolution as a theory, but he didn't like the people proposing it because he didn't like anybody. And Marx and Lenin were definitely pro-evolution in how they viewed the kind of rise of society and the change of society. And even guys that we would generally like, so von Mises, if you're familiar with that economist, von Mises is the guy who started the Austrian School of Economics, one of the guys. Even his book, he has a book called Praxeology. His entire economic theory is kind of surrounded upon an economic survival of the fittest. So this evolutionary theory that was really set forth by Darwin and popularized by some other guys around that time, it proliferated into everything. And Marx is really the guy who took it and ran with it in a philosophical sense and showed how it applies. It's really important to understand because Marxist revolution, and by the way, anyone here read or seen Les Mis? Anybody? Okay, well, Les Mis, you guys are breaking my heart. Les Mis centers around a French Revolution that takes place in, I think, 1848 or so. And that French Revolution is not the famous French Revolution. It was actually a much later French Revolution that was inspired by Marxist ideology. So a lot of this stuff actually immediately took off and immediately had consequences. And part of the reason it caught on with people, and part of the reason people felt so liberated by it, is that Marxist revolution, these kinds of revolutions that sprung up all over the world. By the way, you look at just a map of history, when Marx writes, there are probably a dozen different revolutions that take place within, 60 years of that. So immediately spreads out. And the reason for that is that there was this idea that in order for a society to progress, people must evolve out of their need for, we'll say, capital. They basically had to evolve into being a just society. So so not only did Marx preach an evolutionary based worldview where people would evolve into not needing capitalist ideals, he also famously said that religion, and when he says religion, he primarily means Christianity, that religion was the opiate of the people, that it was a means by which the ruling class was able to control those inferior to them. Now, the reason that Marx is so important to this discussion, in addition to kind of pushing this theory, is that he's also one of the earliest people to start examining society through its power structures. The idea being that people were either exploited as part of the working class, or there's kind of this theory of economics that is known as the labor theory of value, right? The idea that the true value of the product is brought about by the people doing the labor. That's where value for things come from. In this case, in the way that Marx frames it, these companies, these rich people more or less enslave their poor workers, and they steal all of the profits for themselves, since labor is where the value derives from, right? In order to progress, humanity needs to evolve out of their desire for wealth. And that's the fundamental drive. It's a very simplified version, but it's a fundamental drive of Marxist economics. So again, this is really all I think I'm going to cover for now on that, until I get to Derrida and Foucault. But just as a very high level overview of the first 100 years of critical theory, on the one hand, we have the empiricists and Kant and the Kantians that shred the concept of the metaphysical. And then there's the evolutionary tree with Darwin and Marx that kind of replaces the metaphysical with a scientific humanism and a tendency towards social evolution, right? So those are when we look at kind of the trunk of critical theory, that's where all of this starts. Those are the two kind of major roots that make up the trunk. And the trunk, I should probably go to the next slide here. The trunk starts with two other people named Derrida and Foucault. So I mentioned before how there is a noumenal phenomenal distinction in Kant, right? There's a perception reality distinction in Kant. So what Derrida does with that is he takes it kind of to its logical conclusion, right? If Kant set into stone the idea that we can't actually know if the thing we are perceiving is a real thing. So for example, if I think of an apple and then take that apple and eat that apple, there's something happening in reality. An apple is being eaten, but I only have a perception of the event. I'm not actually, what I'm perceiving is not by necessity something happening in reality. You can wrap your mind around that kind of thing all day. It'll make your head hurt. But what Derrida does is he takes it a step further. He says this. He says, not only do we not have a way to know the thing in reality, right? If I'm biting an apple, not only do I not know if I'm actually biting an apple in reality, but I actually don't have a way to objectively communicate my perception. Right? If I think of this apple, I might picture a green apple, but you might think of a red apple or a gala apple, or you might be one of those weirdos that thinks of a golden apple, right? Or someone might think of, instead of an apple, if I say apple, you might think of a pear or a lemon, and who's to say, right? How do you know that my apple isn't the same thing as your pear or your lemon, right? All you know is that what you're perceiving me holding is to you an apple, and I call it an apple, but we have no way of actually verifying if we're seeing the same thing. Does that make sense, by the way? I realize this is, so much of this is semantic, and I don't want to get lost in the semantic. In fact, Derrida is kind of known for his semantics. So is that, are we good? Okay, good. So note here that the distinction is no longer really between reality and perception, but it's between a symbol and the thing that it symbolizes. And this is actually a huge movement in that philosophy. That it's kind of hard to understand, but we'll see how that manifests itself in a bit. So words are what Derrida, he has a term. Philosophers are terrible for this. They always have terms for things. So Derrida calls these signifiers insignified. So a signifier is something that signifies something, and the signified is what's being signified by the word, right? So for Derrida, since the things we perceive are separate from things in reality, and that perception is only in our head, language cannot be tied to reality, but to perception. And that means that there's no actual objective meaning for any given word. And if that sounds like, I don't, it matters a lot. I'll say that. This is a big deal. This was a huge revolution in science. And we know it's a huge revolution because this is kind of where critical theory comes out of. But the reason that this matters is that it's on this basis that Derrida challenges classical ideals. In fact, one of Derrida's main focuses in his philosophy is he goes back to the time of Aristotle and Plato, and he wants to kind of critique what those guys are teaching, right? And the entire Western civilization is built on the concepts set forth in Plato and Aristotle. And what Derrida is trying to do is he wants to go back to Plato and Aristotle and be like, well, these guys were paid off by the kings of the day, or were paid off by whoever. And so really all they're trying to do is satisfy those people. And that's what we're building Western society on, is this guy trying to kiss up to his superiors. That is actually where he's trying to go with this. Right. And we can kind of put this in a more kind of Christian context by saying, like, let's look at John Calvin the way that Derrida would have looked at John Calvin. Right. All of us here like John Calvin, I think. We all like John Calvin. Most people in the modern Reformed Protestant church would find in Calvin's writings the systemization of lots of their doctrine. However, Derrida would say something like this, that John Calvin hated the Catholic Church so much, and he wanted to change things so badly that he felt were evil and stop the Pope from having influence. So he really only wrote the Institutes, for example, as a means of sticking it to the Catholics to set his own church up for success. The fact that we use it today as the basis for our doctrine is far beyond the scope of the author's original intent, and therefore we ought to deconstruct it to see what's actually going on. When he says deconstruct, he doesn't mean take all the words apart and analyze it bit by bit. He's saying, what is Calvin actually trying to do here? He's not actually trying to write a systematic theology. He's actually trying to overthrow the Pope, right? And that's very much the way that Derrida looks at these things. And by the way, I don't know how much you guys know about critical theory, but hopefully you're seeing how we're kind of getting into that a little bit more when we start talking about things in that way, right? We talked about a few weeks back how this kind of criticism is often leveled at the Bible. This is where kind of this Derrida thing here is where that Christian deconstructionism is rooted. Just to put it in context of that discussion, Derrida's deconstruction is very, very suspicious of groupthink. That's actually its main goal. This is actually kind of why I have a love-hate relationship with Derrida. I'll get into that in a minute. But I just want to protect myself against the trolls a little bit. Derrida actually specifically said that deconstructionism is not a critical theory. It's not an analysis, and it's not a methodology. Actually, if I were trying to be as honest to Derrida as possible, I think he would say that it's undefinable, and he wouldn't want to define it, because he would also admit this, that if he defined deconstructionism, it would then become something you could deconstruct, right? So it's kind of against the point to even have something to define there. And he was actually, one thing I'll grant Derrida is he was very, very honest in saying that deconstruction is both self-defeating and self-referential, given that it deconstructs the very language that it's using to deconstruct other things, which, again, I appreciate the honesty. You know what I mean? Like he recognized, I think, more than anything, that it was a tool and a system that you use to tear other things down. So from this point on, whenever I'm talking about deconstructionism, I'm meaning it in the modern sense. And that's why I want to kind of make a distinction between this kind of deconstructionism and the kind that we talked about last time, right? That they really are different things. And this is where that difference kind of matters. They're both wrong, but for different reasons. So when I talk about deconstructionism from now on, I'm going to be talking about it in kind of the postmodern critical theory sense. So once Derrida kind of passed the torch, the guy he passed the torch on to was this guy. I hope I didn't go too many. I did. Was this guy Foucault. Foucault is, in my opinion, the biggest problem in philosophy since Marx. And yeah, he's just a bad guy. If Derrida was the guy that laid a foundation of critical theory, Foucault is really the guy who built the house upon which modern critical theory is based. And so let me just give you a bit about him. I don't feel like talking about Foucault too much, but I will give you a little bit. The funny thing is that he actually studied under Derrida, but Foucault really didn't like Derrida. Or Derrida didn't like Foucault. Foucault initially respected Derrida, but Derrida didn't like Foucault. And I think, like, I haven't read anything that makes me think this. I just know some of their interactions. I think it's because Foucault was full of himself and refused to apply a deconstructionist mindset to himself. And so there's actually a funny story where Foucault went to a seminar that was run by Derrida, basically, or like Derrida was teaching. And Derrida went into it and he opened up one of Foucault's books, and he just deconstructed it for the entire seminar, which is awesome, by the way. And Foucault was really mad. The name of the book was History of Madness. Foucault was really, really mad that Derrida would do that, especially because he considered like Derrida kind of a mentor. But I think one of the reasons Derrida didn't like Foucault is because Foucault was very, very political. And he kind of throughout his life oscillated between being just an outright like communist and Marxist, and being kind of like a Marxist influenced leftist, kind of like what the critical theorists are today. Like those are really kind of the two parts of his life where he varied between. Now, he wouldn't call himself a Marxist. Marxists generally don't like to call themselves Marxists, but he does talk like one. Foucault, by the way, he was also a homosexual who died from AIDS and promulgated a lot of public support for the homosexual movement in the 70s and 80s. So again, when I say that he's very political, like this stuff was all very much at the forefront of what he was about. His philosophy was primarily focused on the idea that power is more than political power. And this is why he's not straight up Marxist, by the way. Marxists did not really think of power structures outside of the political sphere. Marx was focused on political and economic power as a means of control, although I don't necessarily think Marx would disagree with Foucault in theory. But personally, I see Foucault as kind of like the next evolution of Marxist thought. And I know Foucault would hate that, and that's why I'm going to stick with it. But let me give you just a very small list of some of the things that you may have heard of that Foucault is basically directly responsible for inventing. Have you ever heard of microaggressions? Have you ever heard of the phrase alternative ways of knowing? We're going to talk about that one. Like the idea that oppression is not active, but also passive. These are all things that Foucault was basically the inventor of. These are all ideas that Foucault created. And these three ideas in particular are three kind of fundamental ideas to the basis of modern critical theory. And so we'll get into how all of these play into the pragmatic picture in a bit. But now let's talk about the modern concept of critical theory. So I spent a lot of time kind of setting up the historical background for this. Now we're going to actually get into critical theory. And just as a note, again, this is more to protect myself from the trolls more than anything. I skipped over a lot of philosophical history for the basis of, like, I know people don't necessarily want to hear that. There's actually a whole other school called the Frankfurt School that invented the term critical theory. This is where people like Horkheimer and Erich Fromm, those guys were both Marxists and engaged in what's actual critical theory, and they were intending to kind of overthrow societies. They were really not that successful. Their ideas kind of, the problem was that their ideas, I think, were too just in your face, and they were too aggressive about it. And that's why Foucault was so much more successful, is that he was more subtle. But he kind of took that Frankfurt School of critical theory and combined it with the Derrida deconstruction and the Marxist kind of evolutionary, social evolution ideas. So Foucault, again, is kind of the figurehead of this because he's really where everything meets in one person, and it's just kind of like the perfect storm of terrible that was unleashed on culture at that time. Okay. I know everyone's favorite section on philosophy is over now, but does anyone have any questions on that stuff? Awesome. So let's get on into modern critical theories, which is why we're here in the first place. Am I right? Or are we here for the philosophy? Because I can talk about more of it. I like your thinking. Okay. So in America, we're going to talk about critical theory mostly from an American standpoint because it is kind of uniquely American. Critical theory has not caught on in other countries the same way that it has caught on in America. There's a few reasons for that, and we'll get into those. But in America, critical theory actually started off as a legal theory. In particular, the ideas in legal theory assumed that law should be evaluated in light of its prejudices. So, for example, there's really two ways that I can think of that this applies. The first is, if a law is passed, who, if anybody, is marginalized by that law? And this kind of, that's the first one. The second is, for example, if I'm picking a jury and I want to make sure that I'm setting my client up for the best success, which of the people that I can pick is most likely to have discriminatory thoughts against my client? And I actually don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with those ideas in kind of a vacuum, because from a pragmatic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, right? We obviously don't want to pass laws that marginalize groups of people. And we obviously, if we were lawyers and we were trying to pick a jury to judge our client, we would want to pick one that is most favorable to our client, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with these ideas in a vacuum. And this was back in the 1970s or so when this really came into being, and it really took off. This critical theory idea stuff really took off in the legal field. And unfortunately, academia is a kind of beast where if something proliferates in one section of it, then the infection spreads to the entire thing. And that's exactly what happened here. So the way I see it, there are so many different kind of types of critical theory that we could talk about. There are really four. I know I only have three here because those are the only ones that count as like actual theories, but I guess post-colonial is. But there's really four kinds of theories, four critical theories that I think if we know about them, then everything else kind of falls into place. And those four are, let's see, there's a post-colonial theory, or what I call colonization cultural theory, feminist theory, race theory, and gender theory. And there, like I said, there are others. There is now like a disability critical theory and like a fat phobic critical theory and all of this stuff. They haven't caught on in the same way. They exist and they're out there, but they really haven't caught on in the same way. In my opinion, they haven't caught on in the same way. I don't think most of the culture really has accepted them as subconsciously as they have accepted these major ones here. And I've put them in this order here, feminist theory, race theory, and gender theory. I put them in that order because in just my reading of this stuff, and by the way, I read, 30 plus books for this. In my reading for this stuff, this is kind of the order in which I think they came out. That when you just look at the history, this is the order that they started. Although we'll see, we're not going to talk about this much, but feminist theory and race theory kind of came around at the same time. Each of these things could be its own lesson. Like there's reasons to get into each of them in depth. We are not going to do a super deep dive on any of these. We are going to do what we can, and that's not really the point to get into these each individually. So we are going to start with colonization. Do I have a slide after this? Okay. So post-colonial theory is really the basis for all of the others that come after it. And post-colonial theory, I'll give you kind of how this came about. There's a famous book written by a guy whose name I believe is pronounced Edward Said in 1978 called Orientalism. And this is really, when any textbook you read on critical theory and the history of critical theory, this is the book that kind of opened the floodgates of that thought. And it's the book that really began the discussion on post-colonial theory. Has anyone here heard of like post-colonial theory? Are you guys familiar with that term? Okay, good. I like being able to actually teach stuff here. Okay. In this book, Orientalism, Said uses colonization theory to examine what he views as kind of a Western mistreatment of Eastern cultures, including, by the way, the use of the term Oriental, which he says is kind of an offensive, demeaning term. And in his view, Western societies have created kind of copies of themselves through colonization, which is, I guess, vaguely defined as a process that the West uses to subdue other cultures and then kind of obliterate them. In fact, I actually don't think it's unfair to say that their definition of colonization is literally the process by which Western cultures exploit foreign peoples by invading their land and destroying their culture for personal advantage. And the justification that the West, again, this is all in this view, the justification that the West uses to take over these cultures and exploit them is through kind of a psychological self-deception that Said terms othering. Has anyone ever been accused of othering here? This is kind of, okay. This terminology of othering was very, very popular about 5 to 10 years ago. I haven't heard it as much since then, but I also don't work at a college anymore. So for all I know, it's still very popular, but I know that at least 5 to 10 years ago, this was very, very popular. Othering happens when people in the West begin to label other cultures in a non-flattering way. For example, if we look at Chinese history, we see a lot of political shifts wherein one despot would remove the previous despot and murder all of that person's followers, right? Or where you see this in Native Americans, where they were often labeled as savages due to instances of human sacrifice or cannibalism, or due to scalping and the brutality of their soldiers on European settlers and their lack of adherence to kind of European rules of warfare, right? And if you've ever seen like Pocahontas, and they have that whole song "Savages," like that entire song is kind of about how the colonizers there were othering the Native Americans, right? They could only see them as savages. So colonization theory, colonialism, post-colonialism kind of looks at this view. It looks at the savagery of the natives. It looks at the what they would consider the simplicity of Eastern societies as propaganda used by the West to inspire colonization and subjugation of that society. And there are some significant problems with thinking that way, in my opinion. We'll get into a little bit of that later. But for now, it's important to know that this serves as the foundation for many other critical theories. You'll hear like this phrase normative. What's normative is in this kind of view, what's normative is always defined by the person that's the group of people that are labeled as the oppressing group, right? And so through this history of othering, normal, according to this view, has become defined as heteronormative white males. And they're cisgender too, that's the other thing. Whenever an imbalance is sensed in society, everything boils down to this group of white heteronormative cisgender males othering the other group of people. Right? For example, there are less women than men in positions of political power, which according to this view is because men tend to engage in othering with women. Women are more emotional, they're less physical or mentally strong, or whatever you want to say, right? And these kind of descriptions of women are an example of what they would call othering. These are common reasons listed as to why that might be. And you can't even really talk about why this might be without being labeled as someone who is engaging in othering. And by the way, I use feminism as an example here, but seminal, I cannot speak tonight. Similar examples could be given for, pick your group. It could be given for Black people, for LGBT people, or any other potentially marginalized groups. And I think it's fair to say that every other critical theory is an examination of how white, heteronormative, cisgender males engage in othering with those potentially marginalized groups. So in my understanding of critical theory, it all comes back to post-colonial theory. How is it that Western white culture has subjugated more or less the rest of the world? So with that, we'll get into feminist theory. Feminist theory generally examines society through the belief that it is structured as a patriarchy, which is to say that it is dominated by men. And this is where a lot of that, if you've ever heard someone say like, oh, not another old white guy in office, like that kind of thought is very often proliferated by feminists, right? I feel like this conversation is actually like this aspect, the feminist theory has almost kind of taken a back seat a little bit. Like it's still very active, don't get me wrong. But the conversation I feel is less active now than 5 years ago. And I think part of the reason for that is because they've kind of won the cultural battle on it. I know it's also one of the primary arguments against the conservative church and Christianity as a worldview, that it inhibits women. Is anyone here familiar with the story of the TNIV? Do you know, Mason? Do you know what the TNIV is? It's called Today's NIV. It was published in 2005, and at the time, so it was a big deal in the early 2000s because basically Zondervan announced that they were going to do this Today's NIV thing, and the whole purpose of it was to remove gendered language from the Bible, and we were going to make everything as gender neutral as possible. And so there's a lot of times where, the term sons of God would be translated as children of God, or brothers would not be brothers. You see this in the regular NIV. They kind of combined it with the regular NIV, where brothers has become like brothers and sisters, right? That kind of thing, which I'm not going to get into too much, but if you start looking at biblical translation that way, then you can really throw off the context and meaning of what's actually going on in some of those passages. But that was the purpose behind the TNIV, and it was actually a really big deal in the early 2000s. There were a bunch of leaders. James Dobson, who was the head of Focus of the Family. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't think so. But James Dobson, R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, John Piper, like a lot of guys that are real big in the church that we all know, that we all like, Reformed guys, got together and basically held like a modern church council on this. And they met with Zondervan, and they all collectively signed an agreement that they were going to adhere to like traditional biblical principles. If we were going to translate the Bible, we were going to try to stick to the cultural connotations of what was actually being said. We were going to try to be as accurate as possible. And Zondervan, who publishes the NIV, actually signed that. And then 3 years later, they released the TNIV, and a week before that, they sent a letter to all those people and said, "Hey, we're kind of going back on what we signed because we got a lot of hate mail." So, anyways, this feminist theory has been around. All I'm saying is that it's been around for a long time, and it has that kind of influence on the church, right? If it literally is so influential on the church that the NIV, Zondervan, one of the biggest Christian publishers, literally went and translated a version of the Bible to appease that group of people, right? So that's how influential. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. A lot of the discussions around like gender wage gap or the lack of female representation beyond these things, in my opinion, these things are kind of beyond the purview of what we talk about here at Odyssey. But those discussions are related to critical feminist theory as well. We're going to talk about critical race theory. Critical race theory is probably the one that even today still gets the most airtime. I will say it gets the most airtime, but it's also kind of been assumed by most of the media groups in the culture, even ones that you wouldn't expect. Matt Walsh, if you're familiar with him, just released a documentary called "Am I Racist?" And it's really funny. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it, but I feel like it was 5 years too late. Like he released this after all of the stuff had already been accepted, and I'm kind of annoyed by that. Like the battlegrounds for this discussion was more Obama era, right? So more like 10 years ago is when this stuff was really, the battlegrounds for it was really taking place. And as you might have guessed, critical race theory examines society by looking at things through the lens of racial power. And there are a lot of terms that go along with that. Most of the terms that we associate with critical theory actually find their basis in critical race theory. So the first one I want to talk about is hegemonic power. These are terms you should be aware of because they are kind of like hot button terms that people do use. And by the way, a lot of the discussion on this, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with a guy named Neil Shenvi. He's done a lot of really good work on Christian social justice, and he has a lot of good stuff on critical race theory, and he's a resource that if you want to learn more, I highly recommend going. And he has a whole ministry that's dedicated to the church in relation to social justice, and I think he's got a pretty solid take on most of the stuff. So, hegemonic power. Hegemonic power it's really a term about how a dominant group maintains its dominance over others over a long period of time. And this is part and parcel with the discussion of colonialism, right? How is it that old white guys, even if they're a minority, have maintained their political power, right? Everybody nowadays, this is how they'll talk. Everybody nowadays know that old white guys are the problem. So why is it that every time there's an election, a whole bunch of old white guys are still elected in office? And that's because of the hegemonic power that they've set up in the system, right? The system is is their hegemony, and that's how they continue in power. Another term is anti-racism. Anti-racism is the idea that it's not okay to just not be racist. Like, that's no longer good enough, just not being racist. And so now we have to do more than not be racist, but we have to pledge to work and acknowledge and deconstruct our white privilege in order to create equal opportunity for all colors of people. White fragility and white defensiveness, they're kind of the same thing. This term was really popularized by someone named Robin DiAngelo, who is one of the biggest shysters in modern culture. But white fragility is the tendency for white people to react nervously or in a subtly negative way when discussing issues related to race. So if you want to talk about like racial differences, do we dodge the questions? Do we kind of make excuses for it? Do we try to, how do we react to it? And if it's in anything but utter absolute agreement and submission to the thought, then we are engaging in either white privilege or white fragility or white defensiveness. Like, those are the two things. That's really the only options here. White privilege is related to that, and white privilege is whatever it is that you, if you're a white person, whatever it is that you have that makes you successful when other races are not. It's weird because it's a systemic thing, but they'll use it to define between individuals. So like if there's a poor black person and a rich white person, they'll say that that's an example of white privilege. Even though it's technically supposed to be a systemic discussion, it's not it's by definition is trying to be vague and confusing. Intersectionality is another one. Intersectionality is actually where critical theory started in legal terms. It's the term to describe the different ways that one person can be marginalized, or just the different groups that a person belongs to, right? So everybody here belongs to more than one group of oppressed or oppressor, right? If you're Julia, for example, you are a white woman, which means that on the one hand, you are part of the white oppressing class, and on the other hand, you are part of the marginalized female class. That's part of it. If you are Mason, then you are doubly oppressive as both a white male and are both a white person and a male. Cisgender too. Yeah. You can, it gets so much like fit, right? If you're a fit person, you have privilege because, you didn't work for that. You just naturally were that way. Like, again, it builds on itself. And, I've seen people like kind of spoof it by creating pyramids of intersectionality where like the most righteous person in the intersectional framework is like, the black, overweight, lesbian, non-binary person, because they're intersectionally marginalized in like every possible way. Right. And like that's absolutely, it's a satire of the system, but it's kind of honest. Like, it's not far off on how it actually is. Even if they wouldn't say it, that's pretty much how it works. The last one here is alternative ways of knowing. I mentioned this before. We'll get into this. We're going to talk about epistemology a little bit. This is less of a term used than an idea employed in post-colonial theory. It's the idea that Western tools are inherently racist and sexist because they were developed by a white, Western, male-dominated society. So to combat these forces of evil, we do away with, say, logic, just the idea of formal logic, right? That's created by the Greeks, and the Greeks are part of that Western colonial mindset. We do away with the scientific method because science was used to justify racism at one point. And legitimately, the problem critical theorists have with these is that their intense focus on Western, through their intense focus on Western tools, that the West marginalized people groups, and therefore we ought to dispense with the tools that they use because it just continues to reinforce that hegemonic power, right? It all kind of works together. Do you guys see how it's starting to kind of work together here? Like that it's not a very well-defined view, but once you start seeing where all the different parts are, it does kind of come into play. The fourth one here, I think, I like that joke. The fourth one here is gender theory. I don't really feel like talking too much about gender theory. If we have more time at the end, we can talk a little bit more about it. Gender theory is so prima facie stupid that there's not really a ton to be said about it. And I hate to, like, I'm I would be just saying that, by the way, I would be so accused of marginalizing a huge group of people. But like, gender theory is when things have gone so wrong in society that everything is conditioned upon pure subjectivity, and that it's just not an actual way to live life. Like, you can't be purely subjective, and gender theory tries to be. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I do want to say this. I find this stupid for the main reason that nobody thought of gender as a societal function until the 1950s. Like, the idea of gender outside of grammar, the term gender was a grammatical term for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it wasn't until the 1950s, and when there's a guy named John Money, who was a psychiatrist, also a known pedophile, by the way, but this guy invented the term gender roles to kind of explain societal pressures on women. And that is where this idea of gender studies kind of comes out of. Like, people will try to say, no, Germany was doing gender studies in the 40s, or the Greeks had an idea of genders, of different genders, because they believed that there were cultural differences between men and women. And it's like, it's so anachronistic that they're trying to go back and reinterpret history through the framework that they invented in the 1950s. And I just find it so backwards. I don't find, like, there are legitimate people that get paid to do research on this stuff. And I just find it just utterly ridiculous. And I don't think the majority of the world is on their side on this either. But there's actually, yeah, well, if we have time, I'll get into more of the ways to kind of combat that. But I don't honestly feel like gender theory deserves too much more talk about it at this point. Okay, so because, let's see, yeah, there are really, this is where the lesson changed for me. So I'd initially intended to do a different thing where we were going to go and respond to each of those kinds of critical theory and just kind of, how do we argue against it? I think that's less important, and we can still do that a little bit if we have time. But what I really kind of want to explain is how critical theory is incompatible with a Christian worldview. And the reason that this kind of was laid on my heart in studying this, because we might be able to look at some of this stuff and think, oh, well, this is so obviously non-biblical, it's so obviously non-Christian. There are a lot of churches that have embraced this stuff head on. And you see this a lot. Like, there is, the TNIV is a great example of a large publishing house kind of caving into feminist critical theory. That's one example. But just the idea of, I have a friend who was going to a Presbyterian, I think it must have been PCUSA church up in Tennessee, and the church on their front page, the first thing they say is, we are a diverse group of believers. Like, that is the first thing that they put on their webpage. And the idea is, well, we want you to know that we value people of all different colors. And my response to that would be, why do we care what the color of the person is who is a believer? Right? There's something inherent in that philosophy that even common churches, any church that you might see on the side of the road, is now advertising things dependent on this kind of critical theory, right? It's becoming much more accepted even amongst different church denominations. There's now church denominations that, it was always a discussion as to whether or not they allow women into church leadership, but now there's, lesbian ministers, and now there's, a push to diversify leadership in certain denominations. And I think even the Methodists kind of had a break over this a little bit not that long ago. So, like, there's a lot of stuff even today where the church is being accused of living in the past and that we haven't adapted to the modern culture. And in one way, I think they're right. We haven't really adapted to the modern culture because we're not doing anything on social justice, really, that's big and important. And because of that, we're kind of allowing this critical theory of social justice to just dominate the culture. And so I want to get into kind of why critical theory shouldn't be accepted in the church more than anything else. And I want to be fair to critical theory as well. While I think 99.9% of it is bad, there's a 0.1% that I think we can take something positive away from it. So we'll seek to do that insofar as we can, and insofar as we cannot, we'll talk about why it's bad. So that's where the fundamental shift occurred to me. there are a lot of easy arguments against critical theory, and they might come up even in this discussion, but I really do want to present the difference between the fundamentals. So, in my view, there are three tenets of a critical theory worldview. There's an anthropology, an epistemology, and what I'm calling a praxeology, or almost kind of a sociology. So, Deborah was very excited for me to bring up anthropology. Anthropology is the study of man, who man is and where does man come from. That is what anthropology is. So when we say that there is an anthropology to critical theory, we are saying that they have a specific view of man. And in this case, the critical theory anthropology is that all man falls into one of two categories. Either you are an oppressor or you are oppressed. It's so again, because of intersectionality, it's not quite that black and white, because you could potentially belong to both oppressor and oppressed groups. But really the point is that you're reduced to those groups, right? A great example, by the way, of this is, do I have this picture? Hold on. I think I have a picture. No, I didn't have a picture. I saved it. I meant to put it in the slideshow. There's actually a picture from a women's rally in like 2017, right after Trump was elected the first time, that was organized as a kind of anti-Trump rally. And somebody was holding this sign that said, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump too." And that was literally the sign that there was a black woman that was holding it. In critical theory, women are a marginalized group, but so are black people. So a white woman is marginalized because she is a woman, but she is an oppressor because she is white. So a white woman is kind of again, they would hate me for saying this, it's kind of a net neutral on the oppression scale. You know what I mean? So like, you know, if you're a black woman, you're kind of, you know, further down. You're more oppressed than not oppressed. But if you're a white woman, you're just kind of a neutrally oppressive person. And just as a callback to the beginning, this is kind of where Marxist ideology really shines through in critical theory, because Marx is generally identified as the earliest critical theory, and his version of this distinction was between the ruling and servant classes, or the rich and the poor. He actually never used the term critical theory. That wasn't invented until like the 1920s. That Frankfurt School that I talked about earlier, that's where that terminology was invented. But in a critical theory worldview, the identity of a human is related to their intersectional profile, where your identity is tied up in which groups you belong to. You are either an oppressor or you are an oppressed, and that is the length to which you are reduced in a critical theory worldview. The second core tenet is epistemology, and an epistemology is a study of knowledge. How do we know anything? So when we say that there is a unique epistemology to critical theory, and by the way, I think I spend the most time on this one. When I say that there's a unique epistemology to critical theory, we are saying that critical theorists have a unique approach to knowledge. And so to portray this, I have a lot of quotes here. Again, I want them to speak for themselves as much as they can, because I don't want you to think I'm just kind of making this up. I don't want anybody to think I'm just kind of making this up. So let me quote from a paper. There's a paper called Decolonizing Philosophy, authors Maldonado, Torres, et al. I think I have this quote on this next slide here. Yeah. So they say this: any serious effort to decolonize philosophy cannot be satisfied with simply adding new areas to an existing arrangement of power knowledge, leaving the Eurocentric norms that define the field as a whole in place, or reproducing such norms themselves. For example, when engaging in non-European philosophies, it is important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in the Eurocentric definition of European philosophy and its many avatars. Now, on the one hand, again, I want to give them credit where it's due. There is nothing inherently wrong with the interpretation of this, of saying, if you're going to study an Eastern philosophy, understand it as the Eastern people would, or at least try to understand it as the Eastern people would, and don't imbue that philosophy with Western thought, which is really rich, because they do that all the time with things that happen in history. Bless you, sir. A good critic should already be aware of that potential pitfall. If that's all that critical theory intended, we'd be fine. However, the paper has another quote. It doesn't stop there. The same paper continues. This is the longer quote if you want to follow along. Philosophy seems to have a special place among discourses in the liberal arts because it focuses on the roots of the university at large, reason. This includes criteria for identifying and demarcating the humanities, the natural sciences, and the social sciences, as well as for distinguishing reason from faith, secularism from religion, and the primitive and the ancient form of the modern. These are central columns in the edifice that sustains modern Western rationality and the modern Western university. The modern Western research university and liberal arts, therefore, owe much of their basic conceptual infrastructure to philosophical formulations of rationality, universalism, subjectivity, the relationship between subject and object, truth and method, all of which become relevant targets of critical analysis in the decolonial turn. Okay, do you guys understand what that's saying? It's saying that all of these things that we all believe in and have been taught for our entire lifetimes are evidence of colonial thought. That we have been basically subjected to again, they didn't use this term here, but a hegemonic, I can never say that word. Hegemonic structure in which the power of the oppressing class is continued through the use of things like the truth and method of Western thought, for example. That is inherent to the oppression of Western culture. That is the lens through which they're looking at here, where the entire foundation of Western thought is in some ways inherently oppressive towards certain groups of people who don't adhere to those ways of thinking and knowing. And look again at that list at the end, just that last little bit, where it talks about that critical theory seeks to analyze everything down to the concept of subjectivity and objectivity, the understanding of truth, and the method of discovering it. These are the basic foundations, not just of Western civilization, but in terms of just study in general. You want to study anything, you're going to be using these kinds of logic and these just kind of frameworks to think about things. And these are being laid out in this article here as being colonially oppressive. And again, there are other quotes here. I think I have another page of quotes just for you guys here. So here's another quote from a book edited by a guy named Kigendo Mutua. At the time he published this, he was the University of Arizona's professor of special education. He has an article in his book from an author named Linda Tahiwi Smith. I feel like I'm butchering their names, but she was a professor of Indigenous education in New Zealand, and she says this: "From the vantage point of the colonized, the position from which I write and choose to privilege, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary." Again, it cannot be overstated the importance of understanding a critical theory's epistemology. In the name of decolonizing and removing oppression, it actively fights against things like the scientific method, the foundations of formal and material logic, the concept of objective truth, and of course, Western religion and worldview. And what this means is that these things I just mentioned, they hold little epistemological value in a critical theorist's mind in comparison to other methods of knowing. And in fact, to presume the centrality of that method of thought, of the Western method of thought, is actually to invalidate the marginalized experience. Here's another long quote. Again, I don't have too many long quotes. I think I only have one other after this. But this is from a book called The Rutledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice, which is one mouthful of a title. In this passage, the author Charles Mills is talking specifically about race, but if it's talking about one critical theory, it can really be applied to all of them. So when you hear racially, it doesn't necessarily have to be critical race theory. It can be any of them. Charles Mills says this. He says, "The racially subordinated victims, after all, of genocide, expropriation, and slavery are often quite well able to recognize their situation. It is not that the imprisoned lacked the concepts, the hermeneutical resources to understand their situation, but that the privileged lack the concepts and find them incredible or even comprehensible because of their incongruity with white supremacist ideology. Even if they were to hear what blacks were saying, they would still not be able to hear them because of the conceptual incoherence of the black framework of assumptions with their own dominant framework. Whites are imprisoned, reversing the metaphor, in a cognitive state which both protects them from dealing with the realities of social oppression and, of course, disables them epistemically. Now, like I said, this was about Black experience, but it doesn't have to be. It can apply to any kind of marginalization. You could replace Black with any marginalized group, and the general idea would be the same. What they're basically saying is that for the oppressing group, it is impossible to understand the plight of the oppressed as long as they insist on using the framework that they have always used. So, for example, if someone tells you that queer people are marginalized and don't have the same opportunities presented to them as the white heteronormative people that dominate society, it is missing the point to ask for proof. You cannot ask for proof. If you are asking for proof, you're asking, well, how do you know that that group is oppressed from an objective standpoint? You've missed the point of the oppression. And in fact, by asking for scientific proof, you are actively partaking in that kind of oppression. Those are the tools of Western society, and therefore they are oppressive. That makes a discussion on epistemology very difficult in critical theory, because there needs not be an objective basis for truth, since the experience of oppression is rooted in subjectivity. A Black person can specify what is oppression, but a white person cannot. And, for example, and to ask questions about it is to deflect, resulting in either a response of oppressive defensiveness or oppressive fragility. So I think that generally, that explanation, are there any questions on that? Like, I realize what's up? Because, so hold on, let me set up the question so people listening know. He's asking, why is the system considered racist? And the basis for that is, well, look at who's in power, right? It's a bunch of white old guys. Right. More or less. It looks at outcome, and it assumes that difference in outcome is a result of difference in opportunity or difference in treatment. And since a lot of scientific studies kind of have proved, I'm kind of going backwards. This isn't how they would talk, but since a lot of scientific studies have kind of proven that a lot of it's not true, they would say that, well, it doesn't really matter what science says because that's just the hegemonic tool of Western oppression, right? The scientific method in itself is a tool of oppression. So to use that to kind of be like, well, how do you know, is to kind of engage in that kind of oppression. Does that make sense a little bit more? So yeah, it's a good question. And what's that? No. So it's what, so he's asking, just again, for clarification, he's asking, how does the system of knowledge work more or less in a critical theory? And the point is more that the lived experience of the oppressed is enough reason to justify knowledge of oppression. So I know, I'm obviously not a Black person, but let's say I was a Black person, right? I would know what is oppressive because I am a Black person and I can point it out. Now, you're a white guy. You don't know anything. You know, like, how would you possibly know what it's like to be oppressed? Because you're a white guy. You're in the oppressor class. Like, of course you don't know what it's like to be oppressed. And if you ask, well, how do you know you're oppressed? It's like, well, that's a dumb question. Like, how am I supposed to answer that? Like, of course you don't know what it's like to be oppressed because you're not. This is what makes this discussion so difficult to have in critical theory, is because just asking questions like that implies that you're utilizing tools of Western thought, which are inherently oppressive. Yeah, it's a very subjective thing. Kind of. Because the value is determined by who is oppressed. Yeah, so the end goal, we're going to get into this a little bit in praxeology, but the end goal of critical theory is basically equity for all kinds of people in every kind of circumstance. Yeah, I almost think to kind of think of things in terms, again, it's really hard to think outside our framework. So I think it's actually kind of, in a backwards way, there's actually kind of an intelligence to talking this way, the way they do, where we are really caught up in the Western framework. And so it is very difficult to think outside of that. But the concept being that there's not really, you're thinking about things in terms of what is objectively right and what is not. And that's just not really the point. Like the entire system is so messed up that to think about things within the system It just, it does, you can't really fix it internally. Does that make sense? So you're asking like, well, is the point to make everything equitable or to make everything equal? It's like, yes, but not really through the system, because what I'll talk about here in a minute is like, if you could fix the system through the system, then the system wouldn't be broken. Like, so there has to be just a complete destruction and passing away of the current. Again, this is very Marxist too. There almost has to be an evolution of society beyond what is the current system in order to do away with those things so that it can be replaced with something that's actually equitable. I don't know if that answers your question or not. It certainly raises a lot of question. And the other thing you have to understand about critical theory is that it intentionally does not answer these things. Like, it doesn't want to have answers for this, because the more answers it gives, the more systemic it becomes. And it can't be systemic. Like, again, there's a push to be outside the system, but the more systemic it becomes, the more inside the system it becomes. So like, there's always this struggle in critical theory. And this is why I think it hasn't completely taken over in Western thought yet. There's always the struggle between, well, we want to change the West, but we also don't want to be the West. So how do you do that? And I don't think that they have an answer for that, honestly. I don't think that critical theory has all of the answers for the questions that you're asking, because they don't really care, and that's not really the point. Yeah. I would say that, yes, but that's not how they would say it. They would say that they're just seeing the problems that exist. In fact, that's what, say what? Yeah. Well, so what woke, by the way, what woke means is they're awakened to the injustice that is already present. So in their minds, they're not actually creating the injustice. They're not creating the problems. They are looking at the problems that exist, and they're pointing them out. And the ones who know are enlightened, basically. It's very Gnostic, actually. But like, that's honestly, yeah, they're basically just complaining. Yeah. But yes, that is exactly right. And we're going to get into that right now. So the third tenet of this is praxeology. Praxeology is actually a term I believe was created by von Mises in the Austrian School of Economics. And it is, I guess the way I describe it is the study of human action. Just what do people do, right? Well, what is their point? I link this in with sociology. To me, they're inherently related. To put it in Christian lingo, what should the chief end of man be, right? Like, what is the point of being a man? For the critical theorists, there are two kinds of narratives regarding human action. There is a personal one and an overarching meta-narrative. And the ironic thing is that these two things really don't seem to intersect. This is kind of what you're talking about. There's kind of an inherent incongruity. They tie together in a kind of cycle it kind of goes like this. Society is inherently oppressive in its structures of power, which favor those who are already in power. This is known as hegemonic power, which is the means by which the group power continues to do things to keep themselves in power. And this is the basis for the praxeology. People in power always do things to keep themselves in power, and it is fair to view everything they do as serving that end. And the response to this is to actively work against that through activism. Activism is the chief end of man in this worldview. And it's not merely political in nature. This is the other thing, is that we think of activism as being kind of a political thing to achieve a political end. That is not the definition of activism in a critical theory mindset. So the oppressive groups act by doing things to keep themselves in power, thereby unbalancing the structures of power in their favor. It's ironic to me that they even care about structures of power in their own worldview. Like they want to critically analyze structures of power, but the perfect worldview in that mindset would be one where there's no such thing as a structure of power. Again, very, very bizarre to me. The only recourse for the oppressed class is to undo the system that is imbalanced and replace it with something that is balanced, that has no inherent imbalance, which again would imply to me that there's no such thing as a structure of power. I've never heard anyone explain to me what that looks like. I've never read a critical theorist that can explain what it means to have a perfectly balanced system of power, nor have I heard anyone even say that it's actually attainable. It's again, very intentionally vague, to your point. Anyone who tries to maintain the status quo in any way is siding with the oppressing group. Here's another quote. I think this is my last one, from Delgado and Stefancic. They have probably the most influential and introductory book on critical race theory. And it's probably the most important book on the subject from its era. I think it was right around Obama's first term, since it kind of systematized the worldview. And in that book, Delgado and Stefančić say this. They say, unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. How does that transformation work? Who really knows? To be clear, it is not a critical theory, really, if there's no activism. Like, activism is inherent to a critical theory. The entire foundation of critical theory is an assumption of oppressive class and oppressed class, and an assumption that this dichotomy is inherently bad. And by the way, this is where anti-racism comes in, right? If you know that this is the case and you don't do anything to change the balance, then you might as well just be an oppressor, right? That's why anti-racism is no longer recognizing the problem and trying to fix yourself, but actually going that extra step to fight systemic racism, in anti-racist case, fighting systemic racism wherever you see it. Those who side with the good side and the oppressed are those who are good side with the oppressed. Those who are bad side with the oppressors, ultimately, anyways. So knowing this distinction and being able to see it, again, this is where the term woke comes. If you can actually see it, then you are woke. It implies an awakening to the inherently oppressive structures. To be woke is to, in a sense, be an activist. That's why every woke person you know is an activist. Those two things are inseparable. Now, that does not mean that all activism is political, since the political system is part of the problem. And this goes back to Marx and Engels, who did not use the term activism, but said that humanity would overcome their need for power structures through a kind of social evolution where they would cast off the chains of capitalist materialism for the greater good. And by the way, that kind of language is like exactly how they talk. They would cast off the chains of capitalist materialism. I came up with that, and it sounds so Marxist, and I'm kind of scared for my soul. This kind of idea carried on into the Frankfurt School and on into modern critical theories, where the activism has less to do with the political system and more to do with what MacDonald and Young, their two authors, they call scholarship activism. We're going into schools and changing the academic procedures and thought process. But beyond that, whenever you see like Black Lives Matter riots, or if you remember like the Chaz Chop debacle in Seattle, and many other things are a form of critical theory activism. Very famous of critical race theory activism is when Eric Clanton, a philosophy professor at a local community college, assaulted like 5 or 6 people or something like that with a bike lock in the name of fighting against fascist, racist structures of power. And by the way, he was kind of let off just with a probation. He wasn't actually even really like punished for it because this happened in California. So that kind of explains that a little bit. So the praxeology of the critical theorists is to combat oppression in all of its forms at all levels, including the personal, societal, and academic ones. And there is no higher calling in critical theory, and indeed that is kind of the whole point of critical theory. And sociologically, the oppressors are labeled in one of two ways. They're either actively oppressing or they have internalized oppression. I don't know if you've ever heard the term internalized oppression, but it's kind of crazy. So you know which side someone is on based on their group identity. If you are a white heterosexual cisgender male, you are an oppressor, whether you know it or not. That is your identity in that worldview. You are tied to those groups. Mason, Matthew, and myself, we're all the leaders of Odyssey. We are all serial oppressors in this critical theory worldview. If you are not a white heterosexual cisgender male and you side with those who are, then while you might not solely be in the oppressor's group, you have internalized oppression. For example, if Deb were to vote for Trump or for any white male candidate to be in office, she would be working in favor of the oppressive patriarchy to continue the hegemonic power. It's true. This is exactly true. The only reason she does this is not because she is inherently oppressive, but because she has internalized patriarchic oppression through her contact with male-dominated society. That part of the hegemony is to kind of poison your mind with these concepts that have taken hold. And you see this with abortion a lot. This is actually a very common argument in pro-choice discussions. If I say that abortion is wrong, me, Sean Brennan say abortion is wrong. It's me trying to exert my male privilege to control women's bodies. But let's say like Issa or Julia or someone says the same thing, then it's not because they are white males trying to control women's body, but it's because they have internalized the oppression of a patriarchal society. So that in addition to viewing society through certain groups, there's also the built-in response that if you are in an oppressed group and you choose to support the oppressors, you are still oppressed. You just don't know it, and you've internalized that oppression. So those are the core tenets of critical theory. I'm sure that you could do this to other things. I mentioned there's other critical theories, but really I want to get into the Christian response. Why does this stuff not work in a Christian worldview? So let's talk about anthropology. I think of the three tenets, this is probably the easiest one to respond to. Critical theory roots the identity of people in either an oppressed or oppressor group, but man's identity, as from a Christian perspective, is not obviously rooted in that. The concept of solidarity, I actually want to take some time to actually talk about this concept of solidarity in Christianity. But the critical theory concept of solidarity has some significant problems, since many people want to say that there is a universal brotherhood of man and a universal fatherhood of God. R.C. Sproul talks about this a lot. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say those things, the universal brotherhood of man, the universal fatherhood of God. To kind of paraphrase R.C. Sproul, those concepts are nonsense. There's neither a universal brotherhood of man nor a universal fatherhood of God, at least not in the way that it's talked about. There's a universal neighborhood of man and a universal creatureship of man, where God is the universal creator. And in that sense, God is the universal progenitor of man. But there's a distinction between the fatherhood belonging to the Christian and the progenitorship that belongs to man universally. So when we talk about solidarity, we do need to be a little bit careful, because that term does have a lot of baggage in the critical theory worldview. However, there are three ways in which mankind does have a legitimate solidarity, biblically speaking. The first is that God created all mankind in the image of God, and therefore each person has an inherent dignity and inherent value. The second is that all mankind are unified in their sin and their ultimate destination of hell without a savior. And the third is that all men have a potential salvation in Christ. Look, we're not talking about soteriology here. This is not a discussion on soteriology. I'm not saying that everyone can or will be saved, but that anyone can be saved regardless of what their race is, regardless of what their culture is, through repentance and faith. Those are the three great equalizers. We are created the same, we're all going to the same hell, and we all have the same Savior. You remember the famous verse from Galatians, for all of you who were baptized in Galatians 3, for all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Divisions may happen in the church, but they should be over important theological issues, not ones of race, gender, and culture. Now, notice that I'm leaving sexuality out here. Look, just straight up, homosexuality is a sin, and if you have to play some vocabulary gymnastics to escape that reality in the Bible, it's not found. Like, homosexuality is a sin. The Bible is very clear about that. Churches who embrace homosexuality, for example, as a valid lifestyle, they need to be reprimanded. Those churches who embrace homosexuality as a valid lifestyle are leading people to hell, and there is nothing loving about leading people to hell. Okay, so I'm not talking about that kind of critical theory here, but I don't want to mince words on this, that there is no place for racism, for example, in the church. And I say this, and I hate to say this, but I've been a part of prayer groups where people walked out because those prayer groups were being led by a black man. And it was not a theological distinction, it was a racial distinction. I've been a part of that group. And I want to specify that I am not saying, again, I want to specify, this was not a theological difference. And there were theological reasons to walk away from that prayer group, but that is not why this guy walked away. And that is wildly, wildly inappropriate. I don't want to be misheard on that point. Frankly, I'll be honest, I honestly do not understand how that even exists in a church. I don't understand it. But anyways, I don't want to mince words on that. Do we have a firm grasp on anthropology, though, on Christian anthropology? Okay, let's move on to epistemology. Critical theory roots its epistemology in the identity of groups. We know what we know because we have partaken in a Western colonized framework for millennia. But to view truth as objective is to deny the lived experience of individuals in a critical theory. To ask for scientific proof of a concept is to deny the lived experience of the oppressed. Because of this, there is no real objective truth, because objective truth is kind of another way of saying Western colonized thought. This obviously presents, not being able to talk about objective truth obviously presents some problems for a Christian worldview who views knowledge as something rooted in the objectivity of God, who created all things to know in the first place. Knowledge is objective because God is an objective God. The logic of Western thought is rooted in God's logical nature. The process of inductive reason is exploration of God's world without reference to the race or gender of individuals conducting the study. That is so far removed from the point as to not even be in the footnotes of how Christians think about epistemology. Now, it is a part of scientific study to declare potential conflicts of interest in scientific research, but no true scientist can follow the scientific method or adhere to the objective truth of God while also adhering to the idea that mankind's subjective experience trumps any objectivity. In fact, I'm going to quote 2 Peter 1 because it speaks about this a little bit. It speaks about the surety of God's truth above even the eyewitness accounts of the apostles themselves. This is from 2 Peter 1, 16 through 21. For we did not make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, following cleverly devised myths, but being eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. And we have as more sure the prophetic word, to which you do well to pay attention, as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your hearts. Know this first of all, that no prophecy of Scripture comes by one's own interpretation, for no prophecy was ever made by the will of man, but men being moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God. If that doesn't speak to the objectivity of the truth of God, I don't know what else does. There's a similar story in John 8 when Jesus tells his disciples to remain in his word because his word is truth, and that truth shall set them free. In fact, over and over, the Bible talks about God as the source of truth and sets God up as a counter to kind of the subjective reality of mankind. Romans 3:4 says, "Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged." Ephesians 4:21 through 25 makes the distinction between worldly falsehood and objective truth in God. It says, "But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him, as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." I know that I just quoted some long verses, but it's important to understand that the Bible rejects the concept of subjective experience as the basis for objective truth. There is, of course, a dissonance between subjective and objective reality, but the ultimate source of truth is God himself. Any other source of truth is inherently non-biblical. So critical theory is incompatible with Christianity on the basis of epistemology. Are we good on epistemology? All right, so let's talk about Christian praxeology and sociology. They are inherently different from critical theory in a Christian worldview. Overturning oppression through activism is the highest form of action that a critical theorist can do. But obviously, we don't really believe that per se. Obviously, Ecclesiastes 12:13 through 14 says this. It says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Both Colossians 3:23 and 1 Corinthians 10:31 have a similar sentiment. Whatever we do, right, Matthew, ought to be done to the glory of God. Psalm 73:23-26 says this. It says, nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the verses that we could look at. It's not an exhaustive list of all of the critical theories that we could look at, or even all the things in critical theory. But the point is this regarding praxeology. As Westminster Confession is very clear, our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That is man's praxeology. That is man's chief end. That is the highest calling that a man has in a Christian worldview. All men will serve the purpose of bringing glory to God. They can either acknowledge that and actively partake in that purpose, or as mentioned in Romans 1, they can suppress that purpose, that truth, and unrighteousness, and work against that end. So that is all I have here